Welcome to a reader's history of science fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 10, Stapledon and Lewis. This will be the last episode about the pre-Golden Age, pre-World War II period of science fiction. And really, it's barely even that because Perelandra and That Hideous Strength were written during the war. This is the end of the era of fanciful pulp adventures and borderline supernatural horror. Those weren't the only works around in this time period, but there was a definite trend towards more serious and scientifically minded stories during and after the war. In this episode, I want to take a look at a part of the genre we haven't really touched on yet, with Olaf Stapledon and C.S. Lewis, two authors who wrote science fiction on a very spiritual level. Now, a caveat about Stapledon. When I say he was writing on a spiritual level, I don't mean in the religious sense. He was an agnostic who hated organized religion, even though he did consider himself in a sense spiritual. But it's more that the themes he invokes are deeply spiritual, in a secular early 20th century modernist kind of way. Stapledon and Lewis both hailed from the British Isles, Stapledon from northern England and Lewis from Northern Ireland. And both of them, unlike their American contemporaries, successfully published their works as actual books rather than serialized in magazines. Perhaps the publishing industry in Britain was more forgiving at the time. After all, the other two English-language sci-fi authors who got proper books published around this time were Orwell and Huxley, who were also British. But neither of these men fit the profile of a science fiction writer. Both of them studied not science, but philosophy and other humanities. And yet Stapledon especially was far ahead of his time, and Lewis was at least well-informed and competitive with his peers in the genre. As philosophers, they came at science fiction from a different angle, an angle we saw with H.G. Wells and that we'll see a lot more when we get to the 60s. Rather than simply having a fun story to tell or showcasing scientific principles, both of them came with a particular message they wanted to convey. Olaf Stapledon, for his part, was a philosopher first and foremost. He wrote fiction in hopes of using it to present his philosophical ideas to a wider audience, and he was so successful at it that he was able to become a full-time writer. In particular, Stapledon illustrates his philosophy at length in two seminal works. Last and First Men in 1930, which is a history of the human race extending billions of years into the future. Then, in 1937, he followed it up with the even more ambitious Star Maker, which encompasses the history of the entire universe. C.S. Lewis, meanwhile, was a famous theologian. He is best known for writing the Chronicles of Narnia children's fantasy series, and for his Christian apologetics like Mere Christianity, The Great Divorce, the Screwtape Letters, and so on. But less well known is that Lewis, quite early in his career in fact, wrote a trilogy of science fiction novels, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. Like all of his works, this space trilogy conveys his theological beliefs and values. And I'm talking about these two men together because they are in fact closely connected. Lewis wrote his space trilogy partially in response to Stapledon's Star Maker. In light of that, unsurprisingly, we'll start with Stapledon. Olaf Stapledon bounced around for a while before getting into writing. He first studied history and briefly became a teacher, followed by other jobs in the education sector. He served as an ambulance driver in World War I as a conscientious objector. After the war, he went back to school to receive a PhD in philosophy at Liverpool in 1925. After that, he started writing scholarly philosophy books, but quickly turned to fiction in order to reach a larger audience. The result was Last and First Men. It's a history not only of the future of the human species, but of no fewer than 20 successor human species, many of them genetically engineered. It's framed as a history written by a member of the last and most advanced human species, living on Neptune 2 billion years in the future, and psychically channeled back to Stapledon himself. Astronomers didn't really understand the lack of a solid surface on Neptune yet, so that didn't sound as silly at the time. I wouldn't say that this book expounds his philosophy directly. It's not an allegory like Orwell or even Lewis himself would have written. It's subtler than that, illustrating the themes through the advanced future humans gradually moving towards Stapledon's system of ethics. But honestly, for both books, the science and sheer creative vision are more interesting than the philosophy. You can clearly see the influence of the First World War on Stapledon's thinking, as the book begins with an account of a series of future wars over the ensuing centuries that presciently lead to the United States and China becoming the world's superpowers, followed by the formation of a world state which may or may not be prescient. The thing is, these wars all seem to be started from minor events like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. This might be one of the worst examples of Stapledon taking his personal experiences and beliefs and extending them to near universal laws. He does that in a few other cases as well. Another interesting feature occurs on the scientific side. The reason humans are living on Neptune in the future is essentially the sun turning into a red giant, except that's not literally how it's described. This is a case of Stapledon being right for the wrong reasons. You see, at the time, it was believed that red giants were young stars, which were large and red because they were still in the process of contracting into mature stars like the sun. We now know that young stars do start out large and red, but they look very different from red giants, which are, of course, old stars. In Last and First Men, on the other hand, the sun collides with a cloud of interstellar gas. This collision causes the sun to grow hotter and brighter, presumably by adding mass and because the resulting diffuse cloud around the sun would be much larger in size and would radiate more heat. Whatever the science was meant to be, it by chance does correctly predict that life would have to flee to the outer planets to survive. Anyway, the future this history encompasses is incredibly far-reaching and incorporates a surprising number of modern concepts. The world state I mentioned earlier collapses due to the depletion of fossil fuels. Humanity is later nearly wiped out by a nuclear chain reaction accidentally blowing up half of South America. Subsequently come a series of new human species, some naturally evolved to a stronger and more enlightened state, as was a common misconception about evolution at the time, some regressing back to animal forms, and some genetically engineered for some vision of perfection, one of them even composed of gigantic brains. Humankind's final form, called the 18th Men, although the numbers skip a few, are immortal and highly civilized philosophers and artists who possess a hive mind in some vague, strange way, and seem to have reached a state of societal perfection. Until Neptune is destroyed when the sun goes supernova. It was 1930. Don't question it. But if Last and First Men was expansive, it pales in comparison with Stapledon's follow-up, Star Maker. Star Maker encompasses the entire history of the universe from beginning to end, past, present, and future, physical, mental, and spiritual. It's one of the most expansive books I've ever read in sheer scope. It was certainly the most ambitious work in terms of world building that had been written up to that time. Instead of psychic channeling, the narrator of Star Maker ostensibly gains his knowledge through astral projection, his mind reaching out to the cosmos and gathering similarly gifted minds to him. Thereafter follows a truly dizzying array of alien forms more exotic than you'll see in almost any other work of science fiction, barring cases where they're just throwing random stuff out there like Star Trek, or deliberate parodies like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Literal starfish aliens are among the least bizarre things out there. There are intelligent mobile plants, thinking beings the size and shape of sailing ships, colonies of insects with hive minds that can perform industry and agriculture subconsciously, and even stars and nebulae turn out to be intelligent life forms in their own right. On the scientific side, the late Freeman Dyson gave Stapledon the credit for inventing the idea of a Dyson sphere, an artificial structure that surrounds a star to harness all of its energy, in Star Maker. Stapledon also invents a forerunner to Star Trek's Prime Directive, a policy of non-intervention with primitive species. He depicts with surprising accuracy what we now call genetic engineering before the discovery of DNA, and terraforming. And just the sheer variety of new ideas backed by the science of his time is incredible. Now, some of it does feel dated, especially where it touches on politics and, yes, actual philosophy. Most notably, Stapledon seems to treat both Darwinism and Marxism as universal laws. Darwinism makes sense, of course, but he takes it rather too far. Even though some of the life forms he imagines are unrecognizable to us, many of them seem to be directed by evolution into a humanoid shape, even if they come from completely different origins. For example, he includes an extended discourse about how starfish-like aliens, with their 5-limbed shape, are uniquely positioned to evolve into a humanoid form like Patrick from SpongeBob. There's a reference I didn't expect to make in this podcast. If you understand evolutionary biology, this is actually pretty silly. Anyway, socially, Stapledon clearly regards communism as the natural endpoint of a healthy society. Remember, this was 1937. He doesn't do it in the same way Marx did, though. In fact, he goes much further and makes a point that all vices and even mental illness have been eliminated on these worlds, a situation where a Marxist society would probably work much better. But it's still presented as a natural progression when there's really no reason for it to be. And one of the oddest things, which he carried over from Last and First Men, is the inclusion of hive minds. Most science fiction tends to treat hive minds as something like the Borg from Star Trek, where everyone is just mindless drones. The very idea is unsettling to most people. But Stapledon, again, does it differently, where the hive part is almost subconscious, and people are usually still able to act as individuals and are enriched by it. It's more a spiritual communion than the Borg's mob rule mind control. I don't think I've seen this idea anywhere else. Even the more general idea of a hive mind as a positive good that is truly more than the sum of its parts is rare, and I can't recall any author taking it in the spiritual direction that Stapledon does. Arthur C. Clarke probably came closest with Childhood's End, but he takes a very different angle on it. And these hive minds are crucial, because at the climax of the book, the entire universe is able to form a hive mind and reach outward from itself to perceive its creator, the Star Maker, a pantheistic being which encompasses all universes that ever were or ever will be. And if the array of alien species wasn't enough, Stapledon now treats us to a parade of other universes created by the Star Maker, some much simpler than our own, and others infinitely vaster and more complex, which are to our universe as ours is to a single atom. This vision, framed as the pinnacle of spiritual attainment, is very much in line with Stapledon's spiritual views. Though hostile toward religious institutions, he was still a spiritual man. He described his views as wrestling with the conflict between, quote, the emotional inadequacy of atheism and the intellectual unacceptability of theism, unquote. In other words, his spirituality seemed to be of an aspirational sort, such that my impression is the spiritual journey he lays out in the book is more important than the creator figure, the Star Maker itself. But again, the accolades Stapledon and Star Maker in particular received were more because of its expansiveness and brilliant writing as science fiction. It was a major influence on later sci-fi writers like Brian Aldiss, Stanisław Fulem, and many others, beloved by H.G. Wells and even non-sci-fi writers like Virginia Woolf. Last and First Men was similarly admired by figures as notable as Bertrand Russell and Winston Churchill, and Arthur C. Clarke said of it, quote, no other book has had a greater influence on my life, unquote. And the deeply Christian C.S. Lewis did not approve. Lewis regarded Stapledon as, quote, a corking good writer, but he disagreed profoundly with his philosophy. He mentions this directly in the preface to That Hideous Strength, but you see hints of it throughout the Space Trilogy. He objected to the notion in Last and First Men of humans fleeing from a dying Earth to colonize other planets. Partially, this was because of the damage caused by colonialism itself, including on Earth and as seen in the casual genocide of the native life on Venus in Last and First Men. But he objected more generally as well. In Out of the Silent Planet, he portrays the virtuous Martians as choosing to die with their planet rather than colonize another, implying that this was following God's will. He also portrayed the rest of the universe as not possessing original sin like humans do, so colonizing space would also spread our corruption into the cosmos. In my experience, this is an idiosyncratic view among Christians. I've more often heard the questions of aliens and original sin presented by conservative Christians as quote-unquote proof that aliens can't exist at all, rather than repeating Lewis's view. Likewise, overtly Christian science fiction books are few and far between, but the other ones I've read show the rest of the universe being just as capital F fallen as Earth is. But Lewis plainly believed it strongly, otherwise he wouldn't have written 3 books about it. Oh, and as for Star Maker with its deeply pantheistic undertones, Lewis called it, quote, sheer devil worship. Needless to say, Lewis has a very different vision of the universe. The Space Trilogy begins with the linguist Dr. Elwyn Ransom finding himself in the wrong place at the wrong time and kidnapped by the evil Dr. Weston and taken to Mars on his interplanetary spaceship. Weston seeks to expand human civilization into the cosmos, while his assistant, Dick Devine, wants to exploit Mars for money. They want to use Ransom as a human sacrifice to the local rulers for unclear reasons, but upon arriving, Ransom escapes and falls in with the locals. Mars is known to its inhabitants as Malacandra, and is inhabited by 3 alien species. It is ruled by Oyarsa, an archangel placed in charge of the planet. But the Malacandrans actually worship a god called Maleldil, who is later inferred to be Jesus Christ under a name that seems to literally mean something like Chief Angel. Malacandra is dying because it was devastated by Satan in a physical attack before he moved on to corrupt Earth in more subtle ways. Most notably, however, the Malacandrans are all without sin, aside from rare cases of mental illness which are treated by Oyarsa as needed. Lewis takes the Garden of Eden story and original sin to apply to humans alone, while the rest of the universe, although he mostly confines himself to our solar system, is still perfect according to God's will. And as you can probably guess, this being a C.S. Lewis book, Weston is foiled and the humans are sent home. We see more of this in the second book, Paralandra. In this book, Oyarsa comes to Earth and sends Ransom to Venus, which is only just now experiencing its Garden of Eden moment. At the time, it was believed that planets farther from the sun were older, having cooled from the primordial nebula faster. This is sort of true, but the difference isn't large enough to be significant. We learn that Dr. Weston has been possessed by the devil and sent to Venus to corrupt the Adam and Eve of that world, and Ransom is being sent to stop him. That hideous strength, on the other hand, is set back on Earth. It was written while World War II was still going on, but was set in England in the near future shortly after the war. In this book, Ransom is set against a new scientific research institute that is secretly run by demons. It's a little harder to figure out what's going on here. The problem is not portrayed as being science per se, but science being used to advance evil ends, specifically a totalitarian planned society like the ones Britain was fighting at the time. Even so, Lewis also calls out the philosophy of materialism, the idea that no spiritual or supernatural realm exists, as well as what we would today call transhumanism, the improving of humans through the merging of human and machine, along with the general use of science to assert dominion over nature in the sense of perverting the natural order. Oh, and one interesting side note. In That Hideous Strength, Lewis references his friend J.R.R. Tolkien's Numenor as a real place. Tolkien actually meant for The Lord of the Rings to have taken place in a magical pre-biblical Earth, and Lewis referenced that as a fun tie-in. I have to admit, the Space Trilogy rubbed me the wrong way, especially That Hideous Strength. It's well written, it's thought-provoking, and as a Christian myself, I have few objections to Lewis's values in general, but I do have problems with some major ones that he espouses here. I suppose to some extent it's a knee-jerk reaction against his rejection of space exploration, but as I said, my larger problem was with That Hideous Strength. I try to keep an open mind, remembering that it's not an attack on science as a whole, but as a professional scientist, I can't help but feel like it's something of an attack on science as an institution, of which I am certainly a part. It's more specifically a cautionary tale about corruption within scientific academia and what it might get up to if left unsupervised, but he didn't do a whole lot to distinguish that from the rest of science. Maybe you'll feel differently reading it. It is worth reading, especially if you're a Lewis fan, but while I don't agree with Stapledon's spiritual beliefs, Lewis doesn't do much for me on this particular topic either. But that's something you'll have to decide for yourself. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts, plus YouTube and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. Personally, I mostly listen to podcasts on YouTube to start with, so that's kind of the important one to me, although I do use Libsyn for hosting. Anyway, it might be a little unfair for me to pick a single book recommendation when I'm doing a compare and contrast on two specific authors, but I'm going to have to recommend Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon. The sheer epicness of that book is incredible, and I'm with many other authors in calling it a must-read. As for reading these books, for both authors, this seems to be one of those it's public domain in Canada and Australia but not in the United States situations. This being the internet era though, Wikipedia has you covered. Just scroll to the bottom of the page and look at the external links section. Unless things have changed drastically, you can probably find listings there. Next episode, we finally move on to the golden age of science fiction, with a special look at the man who got it started, John W. Campbell. Thanks for listening.